Hello, everybody. Yesterday, we had the controversial Canadian journalist Diane Francis on the show. She is very hawkish on the Russians on her Substack page. She recently had a piece about how Russia is rotting and why Europe should panic. She fears that the Russians are about to invade France and Italy and the United Kingdom. It's hard, for me at least, to take that entirely seriously, although certainly if you're Ukrainian, you take it a little more seriously. When Diane and I were talking, I asked her to compare the Russians and the Chinese, and she was very, very critical of the Russians, much less of the Chinese, who she saw as kind of competitors to the West and the United States in particular. And I was struck by that, particularly given China's very controversial human rights record. One man who knows a great deal about both the contemporary Russian and Chinese regimes is my guest today, Joseph Torrigan. He is a professor of political science at American University, a fellow at the Hoover Institute. His first book was on elite power struggles in the Soviet Union and China. And he has a fascinating new book out, The Party's Interests Come First, a book about the father of Xi Jinping. And Joseph is joining us from Michigan. Joseph, I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to watch or listen to the Diana Francis conversation, but should we take that argument seriously, that somehow the Chinese are more palatable than the Russians or the contemporary Chinese?
So the Chinese and the Russians meet a lot, and they often put out these statements about their vision of global order. And I think they have broadly similar sensibilities of what they want to achieve. Nevertheless, in the current situation, the Russians are taking a sledgehammer to the global order, whereas the Chinese are moving deliberately and competitively, but relatively speaking, a bit more cautiously.
It may not be your expertise, Joseph, but I brought this up with Diane. She makes, of course, the argument about the Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But haven't the Chinese done the same thing in Tibet and in the western parts of the country, particularly in terms of the Uyghurs?
So China's policies towards its ethnic minorities have rightly gotten a lot of attention. Under the Xi Jinping administration, they have moved in the direction of wanting to make Uyghurs and Tibetans feel like essentially one branch of the broader Chinese community, which is a little bit different from what his father did, as I write about in my book. His father, interestingly enough, had a sense of ownership about the Tibetan issue. It's something that Tibetans who met with him sensed and even talked about later, because he played a role in the incorporation of those territories into the People's Republic. And he at least was aware of a possibility of a different kind of approach, one that was about co-optation and winning people over and economic growth and bringing religion out into the open so it could be better controlled. And that's what they did for much of the 1980s. But there were forces within the party who determined that when you do that, actually, you just give people space to cause trouble. They're splitists, and they need to be cracked down on. And that's a very problematic conclusion. It was a much more complicated situation than that. And now Xi Jinping, looking at his father's legacy, looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think really now wants to solve the ethnic issue permanently. And that explains why we've seen such a hardline position, both towards the Tibetans and the Uyghurs.
I want to get to Xi Jinping's father in a second, but would it be fair to say, Joseph, that there are two, shall we say, competing traditions within the Chinese Communist Party? On the one hand, there's Mao and perhaps Xi Jinping and his father. And on the other hand, there's the tradition of Deng Xiaoping. We did a show recently with Edward Luce, who has a wonderful new biography of Brzezinski out. You've probably had an opportunity to at least read the reviews, in which Deng Xiaoping comes across as a remarkably accessible, smart man. I'm not saying that Xi Jinping and Mao aren't, but are there the competing traditions? One more open, more liberal, one more hardline, the Maoist tradition, of course, being that of the Cultural Revolution, whereas Deng Xiaoping brought a more open capitalism and some degree of political toleration and openness to China?
Well, certainly there are fundamental differences between the Mao Zedong era and the Deng Xiaoping era, but we've seen with new evidence that our views of Deng actually were not always totally accurate. We have this idea of him being pro-reform, pro-Western, entirely flexible, very practical. And I don't want to deny that there was that element to him, but we also see other characteristics that we shouldn't forget. He was someone who really cared about the party's authority, its power. He was someone who wanted economic modernization, but he also wanted to make sure that people listened to the party and obeyed the party. And he was afraid of what he called bourgeois liberalization, which was this danger of materialism and Western influence. And so you talked about whether there are different factions or groups, but I think that these divisions often went through actual individual people, and they went right through Deng. And so we would see certain periods where growth and development was the focus, and then certain members of the party would get scared, thinking it was going too far and too fast, and were worried about the ideological implications, and they would run to Deng. And then Deng would initiate this crackdown, and people would be afraid that another cultural revolution was going to happen, and they would scramble. And then Deng would say, "Oh, okay, we went too far with this campaign. It's affecting the economy. We need to take a step back." And so we saw all of these zigzags during the 1980s that were quite dramatic, that are also part of the Deng story.
As I said, your first book is on elite power struggles in the Soviet Union and China. You are, I guess, in a sense, Joseph, a traditional political scientist in trying to figure out the Soviet Union and China in I guess, a kind of Cold War sense. Try to make sense of these world through elites. Is that, in your mind, the best way to make sense of a complicated country like China, a particularly complicated country, perhaps even a Sphinx-like country from the point of view of the United States and Western Europe?
Well, I'm attracted to understanding elites for two reasons with regards to China and Russia. The first is that these are extraordinarily leader-friendly systems. One of the arguments in my first book is that we thought that during the Deng era, we saw the emergence of collective leadership and constraints on the top leader. But really, what the new evidence shows is that the continuities from the Mao era were still very prominent, and that even though people understood, including Xi Jinping understood, the father of Xi Jinping, that having someone who slips the bounds of the positions and ideas and concerns of other members of the leadership can be dangerous, they never were able to meaningfully do something about it. And so knowing what the elite thinks, especially the top, is very, very important. And understanding how the deputies provide information, how they remonstrate, really gets at the heart of how these countries operate. But the second reason I'm interested in elite politics is because in a Leninist system, culture, politics, economics, foreign policy, all of this was integrated at the top, and they thought about these issues in a very holistic sense. And so for someone running the secretariat or the state council, you needed to be aware of all of these different concerns. And of course, these leaders, they don't come out of nowhere. They're products of generations of societal change. And so to get a sense of the country more broadly tells you something about the elite, but also looking through the prism of the elite can tell you a lot about the country in a variety of different areas.
Yeah, maybe your next project can be studying American elites who have much less legitimacy, although also, I think, certainly on the right, intrigued by Leninism. I've always thought Steve Bannon is the ultimate Leninist, but that's another subject, another book. So let's get to the core of the book. Everyone, of course, has heard of Xi Jinping, the current, I guess, ruler is the best way, the man who is in charge of China, the president of the People's Republic of China. But far fewer people will be familiar with the life of Xi Zhongjun, if I pronounce that right. So tell us about this guy.
Yeah, so what I tried to do with the book was two things. One was to give us a sense of Xi Jinping, what kind of family raised him, what it was like for him as a young person, his career trajectory. But I also tried to do something larger, which was to tell the story of the Chinese Communist Party during the 20th century through the life of one remarkable person. And so Xi Jinping was a very interesting figure, not just because he was the father of Xi Jinping. He was also interesting because of what it tells us about communism. It shows that for him, communism was not just a set of economic prescriptions, but also a source of meaning and purpose in his life. It helps us understand why he remained loyal to the organization, even though it persecuted him on 5 times. He actually took pride in just how bad the party had been to him on so many occasions. But he also helps us understand why the revolution was successful, why its leaders were so powerful, how the party has thought about ideology, how it's thought about its relations with ethnic minorities, how it's thought about the Chinese diaspora, how it's thought about leftism and communism as a global phenomenon. So those are some of the things that I tried to explore with this book.
Yeah, and as you note, he led some of the party's efforts towards the Tibetans and the Taiwanese, and so that's also important in terms of liberal rights. How senior was he? I mean, and sometimes it's hard to actually make sense of some of these titles. I know he supposedly was the right hand of prominent leaders like Zhou Enlai, but what did that actually mean? How senior was he, and how close was he to Mao?
So before the revolution, he stood out as someone who was promoted rapidly and was the youngest person sort of at the bottom of the top. So there was this very significant party congress in 1945, and you had members of the Central Committee, candidate members of the Central Committee, and Xi Jinping was a member, but he was the youngest. And then he was the youngest vice premier in 1959. And so those are weighty positions. But nevertheless, he never climbed quite to the highest level. And he sort of sat between the first founding generation of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping and the second generation of leaders, figures like the General Secretary Hu Yaobang and the Premier Zhao Ziyang, who also later became a General Secretary. And so people might wonder why they should read a book about someone who was near the top, but not at the top. And actually, this, even though it was a very leader-friendly system, it was also one that was very difficult for the deputies, the people who were actually put in charge of executing policies. And so Mao and then Deng, they were often mercurial. They often changed their minds. It was often hard for people to get a read on them. They were jealous of their position. They were always afraid that the potential successors and deputies would do something they didn't want while they were still alive, but they were especially concerned that their successors would debunk them after their deaths and pursue a new agenda. These deputies were told to do multiple things at once. They weren't told what was more important or how to achieve them. If they went too far in one direction, they might be accused of committing an ideological heresy. You had all these other people in the elite who were competing with you and wanted to steal your power. And so Xi Jinping would have seen all of this. You would have seen just how hard it was for people to maneuver in this kind of system and avoid purges or worse.
It was Darkness and Noon, 1984, all these classic dystopian books. How would you most define him? Was he a hard man like Stalin? Was he an intellectual like Trotsky? Was he brave, perhaps like Trotsky too? What was his defining quality? Was he honest, brave? He seems to be, if not a masochist, certainly somebody quite willing to put up with the pain inflicted from the party on him. Was that because he was a believer, or he just was as tough as nails?
Yeah, so his loyalty and dedication to the party certainly have to be forefronted as his most outstanding characteristic, right? And so To understand why, I think requires us to take a step back and think about the political culture of the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union. And you mentioned Darkness at Noon, which is a wonderful novel for illustrating the emotional atmosphere of these kinds of organizations, which is in Darkness at Noon, you see these people who are totally loyal to Stalin, even though they're executed by Stalin. And it's true that often people, when they were sent to their deaths, they said, "Long live Stalin," on the way. And so, why is this the case? Well, one reason is that for them, the party was a manifestation of a world historical force, and therefore the party can't make mistakes. And so, if the party loses its faith in you, you want to work even harder to win back the party's trust. And also for them, Stalin and Mao, they were seen as the embodiment of these parties. And so to deny them would be denying your own source of meaning in your life, right? And so for Xi Jinping, you would see him tell people who complained about the party that, well, I bet you didn't suffer as much as me. I bet you didn't go through this. I bet you don't have these kinds of scars. And it was a way of him signaling, credentialing in a way that this kind of experience that he described as forging was a way of revealing your metal and also making it stronger at the same time.
When I was in graduate school at Berkeley, I was taught by a guy called Ken Jowett. I'm sure you're familiar with his work, who always argued that the best way to make sense of what happened in Russia or China was using an anthropological lens, that these were cultural events that reflected traditional kinds of societies rather than some Marxist-Leninist ideology. Does Xi Jinping's father reflect that he was uniquely, peculiarly, definitively Chinese, whatever that means?
So when looking at the Xi family, how they talk about Chinese traditional culture and how they talk about the revolution and the party and the relationship with each other is territory that's really worth looking at. And so Xi Jinping, he has said that at the highest level, what it is he's trying to do is end this cycle of one dynasty collapsing after another by taking 5,000 years of Chinese traditional culture and baptizing it continuously in the spirit of the revolution, in the legacy of his father's generation. He calls this self-revolution. He uses this term all the time. But then it raises a question, which is, well, how much of what the party is doing is about Chinese national conditions and how much of it is about Marxism-Leninism? And so this is a perennial dilemma for the party, right? And so Mao Zedong, his legitimation narrative, his story about why he should be the leader of the party and not other people, is that he was the one who was able to figure out a way to cynicize Marxism, right? And so his story is that we had all these other people who led the party before me, but they were dogmatists. They could only read books, and they were told by the Soviet Union what to do, and they screwed up, and they nearly buried us on many occasions. And then in the 1980s, what's interesting is Xi Jinping led the party's relations with foreign leftist, communist, and revolutionary parties, and therefore, he was watching very closely when communism across the globe was collapsing. And his answer to why China would survive when these other regimes did not was that they could innovate, that they could take the best of Marxism-Leninism, but not have it confine them to do things that didn't make sense in China's national conditions.
Does that make him more like Gorbachev or Putin?
Good question. So I think that both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin think in terms of being inheritors of many, many centuries, millennia of Chinese and Russian cultures, and that they believe that there was a moment in time where it looked like the West and Western values were going to sweep the world, and that there would be only one way of achieving modernity. And if you wanted to be part of it, you would essentially become an appendage of the West. And both Xi and Putin, the way they describe what they're trying to do and why they think they get along, is to make the case that there are non-Western approaches to modernity and development, and that they want to show that they're doing it, and they want to make sure that the people who come after them do it as well. They think really in generational terms, I think.
I think the Chinese model certainly makes more sense than the Russian. Let's get to the heart of the book. It's a brilliant thesis that, to make sense perhaps of Xi Jinping, we have to understand his father. You've noted that he was purged several times, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. How brutal was it? Was he sent into the fields? Was he put into jail? Was he tortured?
So again, it depends on which purge we're talking about. But since you
Well,
mentioned the Cultural Revolution, we can talk about that. So one of the other elements of Xi Jinping's story that stands out is, so he's a princeling, right? Which means that he's the offspring of a senior leader. But he's always said that he suffered more than the other princelings. And that's true to the extent that his father, Xi Zhongxun, was purged in 1962, which was several years before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And his father also did not return to work until later than many other revolutionaries who were rehabilitated before him. So total, it was 16 years in the political wilderness that Xi Zhongxun experienced. And so he went through everything from house arrest to incarceration at the party school to exile to a factory. He was kidnapped by Red Guards from a neighboring province, brought to that province with a mask on his face on a train, and then put into a dormitory where he was held prisoner by these students and trotted out to struggle sessions. Then he was put into solitary confinement, although he was allowed to go out when people wanted to take him to even more struggle sessions. Then he was sent to Beijing, where he was in prison for more years. In fact, he was separated from his family for so long that when he first reunited with them, he could no longer distinguish between his two sons. One daughter, a half-sister of Xi Jinping, was persecuted to death. Then Xi Zhongxun, when he was finally let out of detention, he was sent back to another factory. And finally, in 1978, when he is given a new job, it's as party boss of Guangdong, which is on the southern border of the People's Republic of China, bordering capitalist colony of Hong Kong. And so that must have also been excruciating to finally be let out. And the first thing you see is how developed this colony had become, while on the mainland side it was all shabby and poor, and he was even facing this question of how to stop thousands and thousands and thousands of Chinese literally fleeing the mainland because of hardship to this capitalist territory.
Yeah, it's almost as if it's a story made up by the Chinese version of Solzhenitsyn. I'm sure there are Chinese versions of Solzhenitsyn. You'll tell me who they are. It reflects my own ignorance. So what was the impact on the family? This guy had a nightmare of a time, even if perhaps he didn't treat it as a nightmare. Maybe he felt he deserved it some way or other. You know that when he came back, couldn't even distinguish between his two sons. How many kids did he have? What about his wife? Who looked after Xi Jinping while his father was in jail or under house arrest?
So he had two wives, and
simultaneously or back to back?
No. Two different ones, and not simultaneously. That was something that the party frowned on.
Discouraged.
Certainly discouraged. And so Xi Jinping was born in 1953. Even when growing up, he spent his weeks in a dormitory at the military-style school that he attended. So he was really only home on the weekends, and both of his parents were very busy. In 1962, when his father was purged, his mother had to make up for some of the child rearing. And then when the Cultural Revolution began, his mother faced her own persecution, and Xi Jinping kind of roamed the streets as someone who didn't really have anyone to look after him. He engaged in street battles. There were these like gangs. He apparently was the leader of one of them. He was incarcerated by the authorities. According to one interview I found that he gave in the 80s, it was so difficult he thought that he was going to die. And then in 1969, he leaves Beijing to become a so-called sent-down youth. He's exiled to the countryside. And what's interesting about that is he goes to the province where his father was a revolutionary, and he must have either then or later reflected on how this forging experience of getting to know the people and that sort of thing might have had commonalities with his own father's rise as a revolutionary in that same region.
It's a remarkable story. I guess you might think of it as almost a Chinese Horatio Alger story mixed with, I don't know, Orwell or Solzhenitsyn. While he was growing up, I mean, you obviously didn't have the opportunity to interview Xi for the book, but while he was growing up, do you think he learned something from what his father was going through? Did he start thinking, I'm not going to let this happen to me? I mean, that would be the logical way of thinking about it. If you're writing the novel, it was a guy who would see his father persecuted, and in his mind, he would be saying, they're not going to do this to me.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Like when you go through that kind of horrendous suffering, it's human to come to different conclusions. So figuring out what Xi Jinping thought can be very revealing. And so some people who went through the Cultural Revolution, they decided that they were going to make up for lost time afterwards. They were going to have fun. They were going to make money. They were going to study overseas. Some people thought to stop another cultural revolution from ever happening again, it was necessary to constrain the party, to prevent another strongman leader from appearing, to focus on the rule of law. And Xi Jinping, he admits that he went through a period of doubt, that he wondered why this kind of terrible thing could happen, why he was hurt, why he was persecuted, why his family went through that. And he claims that because he decided that the party was still China's only true path, that his sense of idealism is more unshakable than somebody who didn't go through that. And so we can ask about what kind of suffering alienates and what kind dedicates. But at least the way that Xi Jinping tells the story, he believed that he wanted to become, to use the words of an associate, redder than red. And why, we can only guess. I mean, one possibility is that he saw what happened to his father and to him, and he, like his father, wanted to double down on proving himself, to show that there was metal in the Xi family, that they weren't going to be scared away, that they were just as good or even better than anyone else. And he also seems to have developed a real phobia of chaos, right? During Tiananmen Square, his frame of reference for these protesters was the Cultural Revolution, this idea that when you allow people to do what they want, they hurt each other, they kidnap each other, they beat each other up, they rob from each other.
Yeah, even though he went through that chaos. I mean, the thing that strikes me is what a tough guy he is. I mean, Trump likes to think of himself as a tough guy. Maybe he's from Queens, but he had a very privileged upbringing. He never went to jail. He never experienced his father being sent away or going under house arrest. This is a tough guy, right? This is someone who's lived a very hard life. It's a Hollywood story, from rags to riches to being one of the most powerful people in the world. It strikes me that this is not a man you can push around.
So Xi Jinping, on many occasions, has reflected on what he went through was harder than anyone could ever imagine, and that nothing could be more toughening than the Cultural Revolution for him. And we know that one of the reasons his father respected him so much was because he had so much metal, because he was so strong, right? But coming up in the Chinese system, it teaches you something else too, which is you got to be careful. You got to be cautious.
You got to be a fox. I mean, you could be a tough fox, though, can't you?
So politics is all about estimating your own power and the power of potential competitors, and how you balance the carrots and sticks, right? And so growing up in a family that was itself very disciplinarian, he would have had to read his own father and how his father would react to things. And his father really, even among a group of families that really took discipline at home seriously, the Xi family was famous for being even tougher. And even Xi Jinping, the mother of Xi Jinping, in a commemorative article, said that even she thought that her husband was too tough on the children, right? And so for Xi Jinping, he would have seen his father going through all of these purges. He would have seen his father involved in all of these political struggles at the very top. And so he would have learned when you act and when you bide your time, right? And so being tough doesn't mean that you're always a brawler. It doesn't mean that you come out swinging all the time. It
No, no,
doesn't
I
mean that
take
you
that point.
always have to
I'm not
be.
suggesting it does. In fact, the
Yeah.
reverse is true. We've done lots of shows on Xi. I was telling you earlier, a lot of people argue that a lot of hawks argue that he's trying to aggregate as much power as Mao, and now the Chinese system is even more authoritarian. What's your take in terms of this book? Is Xi, in a sense, trying to remake Mao or Maoism in China? Is he as greedy for power as perhaps Mao was? Is he trying to reestablish a kind of totalitarian system, or at least in terms of the narrative that you develop in your new book? Does it make you more or less of a hawk about Xi and Xi's China?
Yeah. So when you say greedy, you're making a judgment that Xi Jinping thinks it's all about him. But my own sense, and you can tell me if you disagree, is that he
Well, I'm not
doesn't
going to
see that
disagree. You know a
binary.
billion times more about this than me.
Yeah, I don't think he sees it as a binary. I think that he believes strongly that what's good for him is good for the party, because what's good for the party is a core leader, a leader that people listen to, somebody who can make decisions, somebody who can firewall choices away from what the communists have always called parliamentary popularity, this idea that the party can aggregate interests and take tough choices in a way that's impossible in democracies. That's why they think that their system is better, and why they're able to outcompete the West, at least one of the reasons, right? And so, is Xi Jinping another Mao? Does he think he's another Mao? A couple things to say about that. One is, China has always been an extraordinarily leader-friendly system. So, as I said earlier, we used to think of Deng Xiaoping as somebody who listened to other people in the elite, who was constrained by them. We now know that even when the lessons of strongman rule were at their strongest after the Cultural Revolution, the party was still not able to overcome that legacy. And Deng removed Hu Yaobang in 1987. He did the crackdown on Tiananmen Square. These were choices that he took on his own, and believed he could take on his own, and believed that he had the right to, because he thought that, again, the Chinese system only worked when you have a core. Deng said something very interesting once. He said, look at the Cultural Revolution. If we didn't have a core, everything would have fallen apart, meaning Mao. But of course, if you didn't have a core in the form of Mao, the Cultural Revolution wouldn't have happened in the first place, because Mao wouldn't have had the authority to start one. But for Deng, the issue isn't constraining the leader from making bad choices. It's enabling the leader to make any choice that they want, to ensure that if there's ever a crisis, the center holds, right? And so the party has always been very leader friendly. That's not new, I think. But more broadly, is Xi Jinping a Maoist? Is what he's trying to do a Maoist agenda? Well, what's interesting is Xi Jinping has repeatedly said that he dedicated his life to the party to stop another cultural revolution from happening. And he's talked about how the Cultural Revolution was a disaster, how it was disillusioning. Nevertheless, there are messages that come out of the party that suggest they think that the party went too far in another direction after Mao's death, that then they didn't care about struggle enough. They didn't care about vigilance enough, that they didn't think enough about class struggle. And so what he says he's trying to do is avoid the extremism of the Mao era, while also addressing the real challenges that emerged since. But what that means is not always clear, right? Because struggle is an ambiguous concept. It's not like a legal term. And so that's why when we see these debates about whether he cares more about the economy or security, he cares about both. And in theory, you can't have one without the other. But in actuality, pursuing both at the same time can also be really hard.
The thing we in the West scratch our head about Xi is the question of Taiwan and the growing war clouds over Taiwan and Chinese ambition there. In terms of your new book and all your thinking about this relationship between Xi and his father, has it taught you anything? What's your take on Xi's take on the Taiwan issue?
Well, one thing you'll learn from my book is that Taiwan for Xi Jinping isn't just national business, it's family business, and it's unfinished business. So his father was a United Front guy. maybe the leading United Front guy in the party. Well, what does that mean? Well, the United Front was all about finding who your friend is and empowering them, finding who's in the middle and winning them over, and undermining the implacable enemies. And he used that approach to the nationalists, both during the Civil War, but then again in the 1980s when Taiwan was part of his bailiwick. And so he was engaged in these secret back channels with Taipei. He was involved in all of these political operations, thinking about how you win the Taiwanese over. And Xi Jinping has said that he is the guarantor of Chinese territory as bequeathed to him by his ancestors, and he's not going to be the one to lose it. But I think that there are elements to Xi Jinping that we should keep in mind as well. One is that national rejuvenation can't be finished without Taiwan, but one of the easiest ways to knock the course off is to fight a war over Taiwan and lose it, right? And so what his father story also suggests is the toolkit for dealing with Taiwan isn't just force, right? You need to have at least the threat of force. But what you want to do is win without firing a shot, which means that you combine threats with empowering people and using them and empowering them so that then you can draw upon their own position to secure, I think, in what Xi Jinping wants, which is unification.
What's the scorecard for you on Xi in terms of China's role in the world? Strikes me again as an amateur here, a generalist, is that the dumber Trump is, the more short-sighted and brutal Putin is in Ukraine and elsewhere, the better Xi looks, the less he seems to do. He just sits back and lets his rivals destroy themselves. Not that Putin, I guess, is a rival, but he seems to be a pretty good player of the new great power politics in the early 21st century. Is that fair? And in a sense, perhaps, did he learn that from being a vagrant on the street and understanding violence and power?
Yeah. So I think that Xi Jinping came up through the school of hard knocks, and he is very, very, very sensitive to power relations. And so in that sense, he has proven to be more cautious than Xi Jinping. He certainly made mistakes, some very significant mistakes, but also he has a very difficult set of cards that he holds, right? And he could have played them much worse than he did. And he hasn't deliberately sparked any major crises for China that were as debilitating, for example, as Mao and the Great Leap Forward, or Mao and the Cultural Revolution, or Deng Xiaoping and the crackdown on Tiananmen Square. I mean, these were disasters for the nation and for the party. And Xi Jinping certainly doesn't have a perfect scorecard, but I would argue that he hasn't really quite approached that level of catastrophe as some of his predecessors did. And so I think story here is, first of all, to get a sense of what the Chinese elite thinks about him and how they understand the relationship between the rise of China and the persistence of American power. And so for them, they see China's rise as inexorable, right? They see the Chinese Communist Party as an organization that can impose costs on society, one that can achieve both material and spiritual civilization, as opposed to the United States, which, at least the way they talk about it, is materially rich but spiritually poor. It's a society where capitalists get to make decisions that are not good for the rest of society, and therefore creates wealth disparities that make people increasingly disillusioned with American society, but that nevertheless, American policymaking towards China will become increasingly aggressive and gambler-esque as China gets more powerful, because they'll want to do something about a pure great power that subscribes to another ideology. So I think that the scorecard way of looking at it, sometimes it will look like China is doing better, sometimes it will look like the United States is doing better. The challenge, of course, is how you manage that competition, right? So how you cooperate in ways that are actually possible without letting the Chinese take advantage, but also compete in a way that doesn't make any kind of dialogue impossible.
Yeah, certainly more success. My sense is more successful than unsuccessful. Not that there aren't inequalities in China between the super rich and everyone else. A couple more very brief questions, Joseph. You've been wonderfully generous with your time. This is a very general question, but I'm still going to ask it. How do most Chinese think about Xi? I mean, do they think of him as an uncle, a great leader like Mao, as a safe pair of hands? Do they sympathize with him because of all the struggles in his own life and what he went through? Is there a general consensus? I mean, it's not a democracy, of course, so he never gets elected, but there must be a sense amongst Chinese of who their leader actually is.
Yeah. So for reasons I'm sure you understand, it's exceptionally difficult to do scientific polling in China. And people have every reason to describe their views in ways that are different from what they really think because they want to protect themselves. And the other thing to say about this is opinions are very protean. They can shift very quickly. And we see that also in global polling about how popular America is versus China. The election of Trump, COVID, all of these things really kind of made the numbers jump quite drastically. And I think that also helps explain why people like Xi Jinping as well as Vladimir Putin are so proactive, is they understand that people can change rapidly in terms of how they feel about the leadership. I think also how old you are, your gender, your job, how much money you make, where you live, whether you live in a city, whether you live in the countryside, how exposed you are.
Okay, I take your point, but very, very briefly, where is he most popular and least popular amongst these groups? The young, the old, the city, the countryside, the rich, the poor?
I will say that anecdotally, when you talk to people who have gone to China recently, when you talk to people from China, when they visit other countries, there is a sense of frustration that is quite different from what we saw before COVID. And that there is this doubt about the direction of the country, worries about where they're going. COVID, I think, was very significant as a watershed in terms of in terms of these feelings. And of course, the people that we talk to, both here and in China, come from a particular set of individuals, right? So there's definitely a selection effect there. And Xi Jinping, I think, himself is very worried, right? So for Xi Jinping, as I said, what he really wants to do is make sure that the younger generation subscribes to the revolutionary cause. And how you do that is fraught, right? Because for him, it was this suffering that dedicated him. For his father, it was sort of the same story. But can you recreate that situation in a way that actually wins people over and doesn't scare them away? And so you have a crisis in the property market. You have a crisis in finding jobs for young people. He's dealing with that in part by telling a story of national sacrifice and putting the bigger interests ahead of your own, and even tells people that they too should go to the countryside. And whether people listen to that and how he tries to get them to listen is really, really, really worth looking at.
So his natural constituency would be the school people who went through the same school of hard knocks in the countryside, and in an odd way, perhaps not unlike Trump and Putin.
So you mean in the terms of
I mean, you've noted that there's a lot of suspicion and unease about him, maybe particularly from younger people, but what about people who really like him? I mean, where's his core constituency?
Yeah, so when people read my book and they think to themselves, why would anyone find meaning in putting their loyalties to a nation, to a party that has brought so much suffering to its people? Well, I think that for many who want more to their lives than making money and having fun, this idea of mission and patriotism and inheriting the revolution is quite meaningful to them. I think that's also a human reaction to. But of course, the question becomes how broad are those sensibilities? How do you keep those sensibilities to the extent that they're there? How you tell stories that are persuasive, believable, how you convince people that what the party says, is worth listening to. It's sort of like a cat and mouse game, right? Like the party is constantly trying to adapt and figure out new ways of going about this. But I don't think that its message is entirely foreign or strange to everyone within China. And we see these nationalists online. Not all of them are bots. Not all of them are paid by the party. There is a streak of, anti-Westernism that I think is quite pronounced in that country that the party can use. And of course, when you use those people, you need to be careful, because if you really gin them up and get them excited and then you disappoint them, then that's not a good thing either.
Yeah, the real question maybe is whether Xi Jinping is the cat or the mouse. Finally, Joseph, this is a book about fathers and sons. Of course, there's a long tradition. You're a Russian man too. Turgenev wrote his famous book, Fathers and Sons.
Mm-hmm.
What did this book teach you? I'm not sure if you have any kids yourself. I have a son. What did this book teach you about fathers and sons? Everyone's written about fathers and sons, from the Bible to Freud. Did it teach you or us, or should it teach us anything about the complexity of relations between fathers and sons?
Yeah, it's interesting. Amir Viner, who's a professor at Stanford, he has a forthcoming book about the KGB, and he talks about how they too were preoccupied with the perennial question of fathers and sons. And it gets in also to the question of China's relationship with the outside world, this idea that was held both in Moscow during the Soviet period and in China now, that because the West is too cowardly to fight a war to destroy communism, where do they target? The young people. And they target them with sex, with consumerism, with materialism, with ideas of democracy. Even avant-garde art for them is an existential problem, because it's not art for a political purpose. And for them, the moment of maximum vulnerability is when those younger people start to come up, and how you win them over to the cause. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago about FAFO parenting, F around and find out parenting, and how it's a reaction to other people who had more maybe gentler models of raising their kids. And whether it kind of had an interesting binary to the article, which is you either frighten your kids into submission or you love your kids into submission. And for Xi Jinping, he sees the family as the first step to inculcating collective values, to inculcating values of respecting authority and putting other people's interests first, and that kind of thing. So, how you win people over, whether it's generational or whether it's how you win over Taiwan, and what the right mix of kindness and strictness is there aren't easy answers to these questions, I don't think.
There certainly aren't, but I think your new book really brings a very original lens on the current situation in China and how we make sense of Xi Jinping, a remarkable man. I mean, the more I hear about him, the more remarkable he becomes. And certainly his story in your new book is remarkable and tells us a great deal about him. Joseph Torrigan, thank you so much. Wonderful conversation on China, the United States, even Putin. I have to get you back on the show. This story of China, of Taiwan, of Tibet, and all these other issues isn't going away. And you're someone who gives it a great deal of thought. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your questions and for having me on.